the rules writers would have us believe that these are, in fact, the same weapon.
Oh, right, yeah, of course.
Greetings to the 23,000 grimdark enjoyers of my channel. Look at that, we're moving on up. This time I felt like having a discussion on game mechanics. Specifically, what makes a game mechanic or rule good? It's a topic of conversation which I often speak about on various videos here on the channel. And it felt kind of funny I have yet to make a video defining what those standards are. And so I thought we could do just that. This video will clarify what exactly I refer to as well-designed game mechanics and rules as they relate to Warhammer 40k, which should prove to be an interesting exercise for myself, and in an effort to temper my own reasoning, I'd invite you to share yours as well. For clarity, a game mechanic as it relates to Warhammer 40k can cover a wide range of the rules we're familiar with. From the foundational core rules like the attack sequence or controlling objectives, all the way down to unit and weapon profiles. Given the breadth of what falls under that umbrella, these kinds of analyses and discussions can go pretty deep. But for isolated mechanics which exist above the core base layer of rules, I find these three scales can be used to help with the evaluation. The first of which, and the one I deem most imperative, is what I refer to as narrative abstraction. Essentially, how well does the mechanic or rule evoke its source from the lore? I've often referred to this concept in other videos as rules abstracting the narrative. The narrative is the golden ideal. For the majority of us, it's why we go through all the effort this hobby requires. And it's the rule writers or game designers' job to adapt the narrative into the game mechanics on the tabletop. I think a well-serving example can be demonstrated through a comparison of the Chaos Space Marines' main rules from 8th and 9th edition, Death to the False Emperor and Wontons. Both of these rules are, at their core, aiming to evoke the vengeful spirit associated with Chaos Space Marines. And both of these mechanics have an element which sees them score poorly as it relates to narrative abstraction. Death to the False Emperor only affects Imperium targets. When a fair case can be made, Chaos Space Marines are brimming with vengeance, that it could be channeled against all their foes. It is further narratively jarring that only their melee combat is able to channel their vengeance. In comparison, the Wonton system enables the Chaos Space Marines' vengeance to be channeled across all their weapon types. But awkwardly so, as it only affects particular weapon types based on the time of day, colloquially speaking. However, I don't really want to focus in on that. For the sake of a finer example of game mechanics abstracting the narrative, let's put those factors aside, and just look at the generative attack bonus these mechanics are conferring. Both mechanics are providing an attack bonus based on scoring hit rolls of 6, which I will henceforth refer to as a critical hit for simplicity. Where they differ is Death to the False Emperor lets you make an extra attack when you make a critical hit, where Wontons turn critical hits into one additional hit. Now, simply scoring an additional hit as per Wontons is more efficient, as sometimes your extra attack from Death to the False Emperor will just miss, which may or may not be desirable based on the relative potency of the surrounding rules environment. But irrespective of that, I'd actually rank Death to the False Emperor slightly higher as it relates to mechanics abstracting the narrative. This is because at the core of these mechanics, Death to the False Emperor crits gets you, the player, to make more swings, which better evokes a kind of frenzy style of gameplay. You as the player see the proc, and so you make that extra attack. Where Wonton crits tell you that the attack you made was actually 2 attacks, which is more suited to sustained fire weapons like beamers or splashing type of effects. Next is functional efficacy, which is much simpler to explain. It's the element which stands out most obviously. Have you ever looked at a rule and said, "What?" and then checked it against the relative norm only to say, "What the fuck?" That is functional efficacy, or a lack thereof. Looking at it divorced from narrative and lore, does the rule or mechanic provide comparative value relative to the norms in the game environment? Returning to our comparative Chaos Space Marine example from earlier, Wontons score much higher on this scale, as Death to the False Emperor provides very, very specific value, which was undoubtedly substandard compared to the relative norms of the time, in this case where Loyalist Marines had combat doctrines. But we can also gauge functional efficacy under the framing of narrative abstraction as well, hence why I weigh it so heavily. An easy example of this are these models here. With the rules as they are in 10th edition, the rules writers would have us believe that these are in fact the same weapon.
Right, yeah, of course.
And the last scale is complexity, which is how complicated is the rule or mechanic to understand and execute on the tabletop. At first glance, it's obvious that wontons are far more complex, given that it requires nearly 4 times the space to describe itself. But unlike the other two scales, complexity isn't inherently bad. Depending on the context, it may be worthwhile. And surprise, surprise, sometimes it is narratively apt for a rule to be complex. Sure, the Thousand Suns Cabal of Sorcerers mechanic is relatively more complex than most army rules in 10th edition, but for an army of nerdy wizards, the bookkeeping necessary to maximize Cabal points is thematic. And foiling that, we can look to the Orcs' WA army rule, providing a declarable once per battle army-wide perk, which is, in my opinion, beautifully simple, very apt for a faction such as Orcs. And this is where those 8th and 9th edition Chaos Space Marine rules sit. But since I'm here, I probably should include the 10th edition Dark Pacts as well, so I'll quickly run through this rubric. As it relates to 10th edition's Dark Pacts, for narrative abstraction I'd grade it at about a 5 or a 6. Look, unlike the previous two rules, this isn't about hatred. It's about venerating the Dark Gods. And there is simply too much variety across the Chaos Space Marine legions and traitor warbands for this to be anywhere but the middle. For a legion like the Wordbearers, Dark Pacts is like a 10. But for other legions, less so. Dark Pacts as an army rule also leaves no room for renegade chapters which do not venerate the Chaos Gods either. On functional efficacy, I'd say it's pretty high up there. Dark Pacts are clearly not lacking in value, and unlike Death to the False Emperor or Wontons, they can be utilized in any round on any weapon type, boosting potency and a bit of flexibility between the sustained and lethal bonuses. And for complexity, I'd say we're about a 3 or 4. It is a bit more complex than Death to the False Emperor, but far less so compared to the Wonton system. That's a wrap on this thoughts on what makes a good rule. And it turned out to be a pretty fun mechanical autopsy for the Chaos Space Marines. If you liked this one, let me know. Maybe it could become a thing. If you enjoyed this video, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And special thanks to Julius Maximus, as well as my other generous patrons and channel members. Channel members and patrons get early access to videos. Just a little something for those who help keep the dream alive. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch ya in the next one.